The late 90s and early 2000s really were something else. It was a period of time defined in my mind by unbridled madness, wrestling, discovering women, shitty boy bands that I secretly loved, Game Boys, Jackass, and of course countless hours spent on my PlayStation. It was an intoxicating time period to spend your formative years in. It was a world caught between the tried and tested ways of the past and the ever-increasing surge of the technological tide of the future. However, whenever you look back on the popular trends of the time, one seems to be as anachronistic today as it was back then. Skateboarding. Rebellious and unapologetic from the very beginning, skateboarding has always been a unique sport from its inception. Created without rules, guidelines, or a need to be truly defined, it has always celebrated individuality, all the while being interwoven with an undefined yet tangible collective culture. If anything, skateboarding is probably more of a lifestyle than a sport. And if you happen to be around my age, it's safe to say that the person who introduced you to skateboarding was Tony Hawk, the skateboarding extraordinaire who catapulted the sport right back into the mainstream with one seminal moment. The first 900 at the X Games.
Get him going, pushing it up. Everybody picture it, here we go. Feel it. Are you kidding me? Yeah, look at this. Tony Hawk, everybody. Yeah, look at this.
The fact that this momentous event occurred shortly before the release of his very first video game created the sort of lightning in a bottle that managed to fuel one of the most successful franchises in the history of video games, and it also introduced millions across the world to the sport, or lifestyle. Now, considering the fact that the internet still had one foot in the realm of science fiction in the west of Ireland during the late 90s, games were one of the few windows I had to the big bad world out there. The games weren't so much about losing myself in a virtual world, as they were a mirror reflecting the people from all around that big bad world that I hadn't explored yet. Ironically enough, upon first playing a Tony Hawk game, it struck me how otherworldly it was to see a group of young delinquents tearing it up on a flimsy wooden board with tiny wheels at high speed. What the hell is this bizarre sport, and how the hell is it so damn cool? I wasn't aware of it at the time, but a simple video game had the power to not only be endlessly fun, but to be horizon expanding, educative, and genuinely life changing. I hope you join me as I sit down and reflect on the Tony Hawk series. The very first Tony Hawk Pro Skater game arrived in 1999 and was the launching pad for one of the most successful and beloved franchises in the history of video games. The rip-roaring success of the original game came as something of a shock to its developer and publisher, as skateboarding was very much on the fringe of popular culture during the early 90s. However, its release came a mere month after Tony Hawk propelled himself to worldwide fame after becoming the first skateboarder in history to officially land the fabled 900 at the 1999 X Games. The timing could not have been more perfect for every single party involved. And not only that, the actual game itself was tremendous. It was the perfect blend of accessibility and depth, as well as being a wonderful love letter to the skateboarding culture. Emulating the distinct feel and aesthetic of that culture was the driving force during development. Neversoft were very conscious that they had to nail that element of the presentation in order to appeal to the hardcore skaters and casual fans alike. Tony Hawk, who began work on the game in late 1998, was an avid gamer who was not content with simply lending his name to the product and walking away with the cash. Hawk was heavily involved in the creative process and motion capture, on top of being frequently in contact with the development team to ensure its gameplay and atmosphere were as authentic to the real sport as possible. Planet Tony Hawk stated that with each new build of the game, he was given a copy to go through. If something didn't feel true to skateboarding or it looked off, he would report back to Neversoft. Safe to say they eventually nailed it. To revisit the game in 2020 conjures up an overwhelming sense of nostalgia that very few things in this life can muster. It was so of its time and for its time. The simplicity of the frantic gameplay, the stellar soundtrack, and the captivating atmosphere of anti-establishment fuckery is still just such a joy. There was simply nothing like it at the time, and honestly, even if the game's visuals have been weathered by time, its personality still shines brightly. And yes, the gameplay is lacking the reverts and manuals that would become staples in later games, and yes, it essentially boils down to grinds, kicks, and grabs, but damn it, it's still so fun to load up a level and just skate around. The wonderful animations of the near misses and the brutal face plants still make me quite anxious. Plus, while there's a finite amount of moves at your disposal, the great level design and seemingly infinite combination possibilities added so much variation across the game's 9 levels. Unlocking these levels involved completing various objectives such as collecting the iconic skate letters, reaching a high combo score, and finding a hidden VHS tape. That last objective really showing off the game's age. All of these objectives had a 2-minute timer, so there was always a sense of urgency to what you were doing. I don't know how many times I must have hit that replay button during my childhood. Whenever a certain goal seemed unreachable for the 8-year-old me, I would fire up free skate mode and lazily wander around while listening to my favourite songs from the game's soundtrack, which was only 25 minutes in length. It's crazy to think how such a simple game made me so happy back then. Obligatory favourite level and song side note. My favourite level from the first Pro Skater was San Francisco. It just felt massive and I couldn't believe I could explore a 3D city, something that was still a rarity back in 1999. As for the soundtrack, my favourite song has to be Superman by Goldfinger. This song just always puts a smile on my face. So the original Tony Hawk Pro Skater was an unlikely gargantuan success story, but it was the next entry in the series that truly solidified my love for all things skateboarding and brought the fledgling series to new heights. The first time I played Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 was back in 2000 at my cousin's house, and I've never come closer to robbing someone than I did on that day. There were so many elements of the game that immediately captivated me, just like the original did a year prior. The simplistic, addictive gameplay remained, the, at the time, outrageously lifelike graphics were somehow even better, and I immediately started nodding along to the soundtrack that moulded my young, impressionable music tastes. I couldn't wait just to get back from school, run into my room and unleash all of my pent-up energy onto Venice Beach. Tony Hawk's 2 is still a game that I load up on occasion and just cruise around in. It really is the ultimate pick up and play game. There's so many now iconic levels to be enjoyed here, and it feels like a playable piece of video game history. Tony Hawk's 2 added a lot to the series, one of which is now a cornerstone of the series, the revered manual. One simple move completely changed how combos operated and made traversing the levels in one glorious combo a bit more plausible. The career mode, while dangerously basic by today's standards, was deeply engaging at the time. The desire to see a beautiful little red mark scratched across every goal was unquenchable. I would often strive towards the perfect run, in which I attempted to complete every goal within the 2-minute time limit. Side note, I never quite managed to. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 came the following year, and it cemented the Tony Hawk franchise as the absolute darling of the industry. It seemed like the games didn't know how to be anything other than critically acclaimed and commercially unstoppable. Moreover, the third entry in the series added yet another trick that has since become an absolute staple of the series, the revert. It says a lot about the upward trajectory of the games that the third game within a 2-year span was implementing features that are now considered fundamental. The humble revert allowed me to string together ridiculous combos and lines that were simply not possible in the previous games, even with the addition of the manual in Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. Much like its predecessors, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 was, and very much still is, a delightful game to play. The leap onto the PS2 allowed the wonderful formula to be developed and perfected, along with a massive graphical improvement. It was the original Tony Hawk formula perfected. I mean seriously, it let you loose on a cruise ship while playing as Darth Maul. What more could you possibly want? The game blew my mind when I first played it, and it's fair to say I wasn't the only one. It's tied for the most well-received PS2 game of all time on Metacritic, sitting on a rather tasty 97, a spot that it shares with Grand Theft Auto 3. And my favourite song from it is If You Must by Del the Funky Homo Sapien. The next year saw yet another Tony Hawk game, but I'm almost ashamed to say this, but I've never played Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4. Back when it was released in 2002, I'd become obsessed with all things wrestling, Spider-Man and Grand Theft Auto, so for Christmas and my birthday I opted to ask for Vice City, a poster of Stone Cold, and the wonderfully futuristic 2-disc special edition DVD of Spider-Man and its movie tie-in game. Between the seemingly boundless possibilities of GTA's open world and Tobey Maguire's lovable face, the Tony Hawk games seemed like a relic of a distant past. After all, a year in those days represented approximately 10% of my entire life. Even though I had moved on to other loves, I can still recall the rave reviews Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 received upon its release. Nearly every single gaming magazine I read gave the game a glowing recommendation, and is often held up as being many people's favourite in the entire series. While Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 didn't add too many game-changing features to the formula, apart from the addition of spine transfers and a reworked grab system, it streamlined the established mechanics to such a ridiculous extent that it was very hard to see where Neversoft could possibly take the series next. However, the next entry in the series was to be a generation-defining game for me. A game that truly ignited my lifelong passion for all things skateboarding. A game that gave a shot of adrenaline to a somewhat tired formula. And a game that I still hold very near and dear to me after all these years.
Back to scratch. Music power.
I've played many video games in my life, some absolutely fantastic, some tremendously bad, and some simply forgettable. However, there are only a handful of games that I can safely say played an intrinsic role in shaping who I am today. Tony Hawk's Underground is one of those games. While I was introduced to skateboarding through Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, Tony Hawk's Underground emboldened my love for the music and culture surrounding the sport. On top of that, it's what I consider to still be the best entry in the series. It was just a beautiful mix of the absurd, wacky, and the wonderful refined skateboarding mechanics I'd come to expect from the series. The ability to get off your board and walk around levels and climb obstacles and roofs to your heart's content opened up a seemingly endless avenue of possibilities. You could really take in each and every area and scope out potential gaps and runs. It was such a simple and revolutionary step for the series, and one that really allowed you to take in each level at your own pace. Thug, as I'm going to refer to Tony Hawk's Underground from now on, just didn't stop with the revolutionary traversal options there. It also gave birth to the wall plant, the hip transfer, the acid drop, and pressure flips. Moreover, it also introduced the ability to drive an array of vehicles in a manner commonly found in the early noughties, as developers desperately attempted to incorporate every or any element from the Grand Theft Auto series into their games. Now, even at the time of Thug's release, the driving mechanics were, shall we say, subpar. Every single car handled like it was floating 1 centimeter off the ground on a sheet of ice. The various maps and cities found in the game were far too small to necessitate the use of cars, especially considering every single level was clearly crafted with skateboarding in mind. But you know what, feck it. I wasn't craving realism at the time. I vividly recall thinking it was the greatest game ever made as I floated through the streets of New Jersey in my tacky ass sports car. You see, Thug was all about that daft fun and making the game yours. The customization options were ridiculous, from the menu customization all the way to putting your own damn face in the game. Now, face mapping doesn't seem like a big deal these days, but back in 2003 it felt so futuristic, almost like actual flying cars were about 2 years away from being reality. There's just so much to love about this game. Jesus. The map editor was stellar, and to top it all off, Pro Skater's archaic career mode was replaced with a fully fledged single player story mode which featured actual cutscenes, a myriad of great characters and locations, and it also bestowed us with the biggest cunt in video game history. Eric Sparrow. The fact the story followed my own custom created character made me connect with the world and story in a way I hadn't really experienced in a game before. This was also the time I was venturing into learning skateboarding myself, so Underground's tale of my skater overcoming the odds was strangely inspiring, and the game was the only physical item bar my skateboard that gave me a real personal connection to the far off culture of skateboarding. It was essentially my Bible. The rags to riches narrative blended perfectly with that culture, and Eric Sparrow really does remain one of the most detestable antagonists in video game history. Seriously, no one even comes close. I mean, just listen to the guy.
I don't care how many kids are waiting. Well, look who's here. I was hoping to see you.
He was just so damn effective being an utter prick that every time I replayed the story, I found myself flying through the missions just to get to the point where Eric finally gets his comeuppance.
Remember? Hawaii, building jump, helicopter? That was some sick footage. Too bad no one ever saw it.
You backstabbing, mob-flipping cockroach!
Hey! What do you say? One last trip around the neighborhood. Winner takes the tape.
Thug is just a special game. I'd almost be scared to see how many hours I put into the game during my formative years, but at the same time I feel like not a second was wasted. It informed my early love of music, which eventually led me to picking up the drums shortly after getting the game, and it was the catalyst for me picking up my very first skateboard soon after that. The game was and still is pure undiluted joy, and it genuinely helped forge my personality and interest during my teen years, even if it didn't actually lead to the invention of flying cars shortly after its release. Favorite tune? Bracket 2 by Rack005. No other song sums up the Tony Hawk series better for me. So while Tony Hawk's Underground followed the open world trend, its sequel would go on to evoke a cultural phenomenon. By the early 2000s, the culture had once again shifted. Jackass had taken the world by storm, propelled by its homemade shenanigans, outrageous stunts, and the lovable personalities of its cast. A man chugging a beer into his own arsehole has never been so hysterical. I remember sneaking into the living room late at night to catch the late showings of it on MTV, and I would often be rendered speechless at what I was seeing. In the time before viral videos were so easily accessible and commonplace, Jackass just felt special. Tony Hawk's Underground 2 sought to tap into the cultural zeitgeist and sell itself as a Jackass and Viva La Bam simulator. If Thug was the series striving to take itself towards slightly more serious territory, Thug 2 is the game that throws out any possible narrative restrictions and builds a story around the most insane stunts imaginable. Thug 2 added very little in the way of gameplay mechanics, with its main additions being a slow motion mechanic known as Focus, a freak-out move in which your character smashed their board in a violent rage, and the admittedly badass but pointless Natas spin. While I enjoyed these additions, it's not as if they fundamentally shook up what was at this point a very established formula. Where the game shined brightest was in its ambitious level design. The game featured many levels that dwarfed anything found in previous entries. The developers also took note that the driving mechanics of the first Thug game were piss poor and removed it from the game, limiting motor vehicle use to its mad array of unlockable characters. Classic Mode was perhaps the most notable addition to be found in Thug 2, and it served as a wonderful love letter to the first games in the series. The mode brought back all of the goals you'd expect from an old school pro skater game, and added some much needed replayability given the story mode's short length. Even though the Tony Hawk games were at this point a mere 5 years into their existence, Thug 2 was the 6th entry in that span of time, and it already felt like they'd been around forever. Looking back on Thug 2 nowadays, I guess I would pinpoint it as a slight turning point for the series. Now don't get me wrong, I for one had great fun with the game. Eric Sparrow was back, and the game was worth the price of admission alone, just to see the gobshite piss himself. Moreover, with me being a 13-year-old obsessed with Jackass at the time of its release, I absolutely lapped up the outrageous narrative. I'd be lying if I said I didn't laugh my ass off multiple times during the game's story.
Do I want the noob?
Or do I want Paulie, Wheels of Fury Ryan, the 10-year-old skating madman? No more grinding on wood chippers, huh, Paulie?
That's right, baby.
Come
on, Bam, make up your mind.
What's there to decide?
Are you serious? You can't decide between me and a kid in a body cast?
You want some of me? Bring it on, bitch!
But while I enjoyed it for what it is, I still preferred the slightly more grounded tone of the original Underground. Luckily for me, Thug 2's follow-up was shaping up to be the spiritual sequel I yearned for. Side note, my favourite song from Thug 2 is Break On Through to the Other Side by The Doors. How can you not love it? Anyway, enter American Wasteland. American Wasteland was released in 2005, and for me it feels like a love letter to the skating culture of the American West Coast. The pre-release promises of the game featuring one large open map for you to explore turned out to be complete nonsense. Loading screens disguised as long-winded, bland, awkward corridors don't fool me. I mean, when you really think about it, is this the only way for the inhabitants of this city to get between districts? In spite of suspect city planning, American Wasteland is the last Tony Hawk game that conjured up that particular feeling that came with playing the older Tony Hawk games. You know, that tangible Tony Hawk atmosphere that created an indescribable rush of unbridled joy as you skated through the world jamming to the killer soundtrack, all the while knocking out ridiculous combos for the sheer hell of it. And even though we're a bit into the video at this point, I'm almost annoyed that I still can't fully grasp at the words needed to fully express my memories and experience with these games, but I'm sure if you're a fan, you know what I'm trying to say. American Wasteland was not as revolutionary as its predecessors, and it didn't really need to be. It added very little in terms of gameplay, much like the past few entries in the series, and it didn't really do much to alter the overall structure of those games that came before it. But seeing as those games were so bloody good, you can hardly blame Neversoft for sticking to what had worked so well for so long. Neversoft did, however, pull back a bit from the outlandish tone of Underground 2, and in turn delivered a more conventional pro skater experience, on top of crafting a decent narrative and an unmistakable personality. The sunny West Coast weather imbued each of the game's levels with a lovely warm atmosphere, which, speaking as an Irishman, was almost therapeutic to skate around and soak up.
God, it's lovely out.
The game also blended in a lot of BMX gameplay to mix up the formula a bit, and for the most part it worked well. The mechanics were certainly more refined than Thug's tacky ass sports car mechanics. So yeah, I liked American Wasteland a lot, but when I cast my eye over the series, I find myself looking at American Wasteland as the transitional period between the glory days of old and the dark days to come. To say the Tony Hawk series' transition from the PS2 era to the PS3 was bumpy would be an understatement. It could probably be best summarized with this. The thing is, Tony Hawk's Project 8, the first entry in the series to make its way to the PS3 and Xbox 360, was full of promise. It would feature a brand new engine, and the large, seamless open world that American Wasteland had teased a year prior was actually going to happen. The possibilities on the newest, sexiest hardware were, once again, apparently endless. But whenever I got my hands on the game felt almost as deflated as I was. I wouldn't go as far to call Project 8 a bad game, just a slightly uninspired one. At this point, we're, as the name might suggest, 8 games into the series, and it's only damn natural that some sort of creative exhaustion would set in. After all, how far can you truly go with a skateboarding game? How can you keep it fresh year in and year out? The original Pro Skater games rode the wave of hysteria surrounding Tony Hawk's rise to international stardom, and together they formed a symbiotic relationship, one continually bleeding into the success of the other. It was a perfect game at the perfect time, helped only by the fact that the Pro Skater games were damn good games, with each and every Pro Skater game improving on the one that came before it. Every entry would have new features, moves, and locations galore, Tony Hawk's Underground perfected the established formula while unleashing a creative flurry in regards to incorporating a story mode and the ability to get off your board. Thug 2 latched onto the Jackass phenomenon and went all in on the insanity. And finally, American Wasteland, for all its flaws, was at least ambitious enough to attempt a large open world, even if, once again, those corridors don't fool anybody. But Project 8 had no such fire fueling it, nothing to latch onto, and in truth, no real identity. It seemed content to have nothing to prove. Its open world was loading screen free, but it was bland and lacked the charm and charisma of the smaller levels in previous games. Another thing that was lost in the leap to the next gen was the creative modes. Create Park, Create Trick, and Create Graphic were all gone, which was the opposite of how I thought next gen was supposed to work. I don't know, Project 8 just felt off, like a perfect husk of a Tony Hawk game. Of course, nowadays I might consider the fact that Neversoft were tethered by an unrelenting yearly schedule and had to get their heads around 2 new systems, particularly the PS3, which is now infamous for how difficult it was to develop for. It couldn't have been easy to build a game from the ground up in such a short space of time, so the lack of features isn't that surprising with the benefit of hindsight. But maybe the next game proved to be better. Do you get it? Yeah, I'll shut up. The following year saw the release of Tony Hawk's Proving Ground, which would be the last game in the series developed by Neversoft. And it was fine, perfectly fine. I mean, compared to what was lurking around the corner for the series, it was spectacular, but personally speaking, I didn't find it particularly memorable. I did prefer it to Project 8 as it felt smoother to play and it recaptured some of the charm of the older games, but when I consider my experience with the series, Proving Ground is placed aggressively towards the lower half of the deck. As I just said, what is notable about Proving Ground is that it was the last Tony Hawk game to be developed by Neversoft. The bountiful relationship between the Hawkman and Neversoft lasted from 1999 to 2007, and in that time Neversoft developed 9 Tony Hawk games across 3 console generations, and the games raked in over $1 billion in revenue. They had changed the video game landscape, made serious amounts of cash, and ultimately were just ready to try something new. In an interview with Polygon, Neversoft developer Scott P said, "9 years is a really long time to be working on the same thing. I think a lot of people here were ready for new challenges. You've got to keep trying to do something different or you'll just fall into a rut. So it was time to put it to bed and move on." And move on everyone did. Neversoft turned their focus to Guitar Hero, while the reins of the Tony Hawk franchise fell into the hands of Robomodo. A new era had dawned. Maybe a fresh set of eyes were all that was needed to give the Tony Hawk franchise a jolt in the arm. People with new ideas to light the spark of creative fire that could lead the series back to the top of the industry.
What's up, everybody? It is great to be here today. I'm so excited to get the chance to introduce you to our new game, Tony Hawk Ride, and to unveil the final board design of the revolutionary skateboard controller to you. Here it is, right here. As you can see, it looks similar to a skateboard. It's a little bit shorter, but this thing is full of technology. It's got accelerometers. It's got infrared sensors here. It knows where your feet are. It knows where your hands are. You can come in and actually go for grabs. You can lean it. You can kick it up. You can actually put your foot on the side of it as if you're pushing along. The whole thing responds like a real skateboard. And I really have wanted to do a video game with a skateboard controller for a long time.
I think it's safe and pretty fair to say that Tony Hawk Ride is truly the entry that the series never recovered from. At the time of its release, I was 18 years old, and games such as Dead Space, Fallout 3 and Uncharted 2 Among Thieves were capturing my time and attention. A Tony Hawk game that somehow manages to appear mechanically identical to the PS1 games, while looking or feeling nothing like those wonderful games, simply didn't appeal to me. Never mind the ludicrous price point mixed with the gimmicky motion-controlled skateboard that you were forced to use. Tony Hawk himself was the brainchild of the board, undoubtedly influenced by the rip-roaring success of the Wii, and had convinced Activision to invest copious amounts of money and time into development. On paper, the idea of a motion-controlled board was pretty badass. Unfortunately, the boards were as unresponsive as Tony's piece of paper. It was an absolute commercial and critical disaster, and one that I honestly think couldn't even be avoided. I mean, Robomodo were in a completely unwinnable position. On one hand, the series was already feeling like a relic of the past, with criticisms from fans largely directed towards the lack of innovation to the yearly formula. On the other hand, Tony Hawk Ride was then berated for simply being too big a departure from conventional Tony Hawk games, a seemingly desperate attempt to reinvigorate a flailing series by leaning into the trends of the time. Something had to give, and unfortunately, it was the series itself. If Project 8 was a husk of a Tony Hawk game, then Tony Hawk Ride was its corpse. Ride would then be followed up with Tony Hawk Shred a year later, and it was such a flop that it ensured that for the first time in the entire history of the series, there wouldn't be a new Tony Hawk game the following year. According to the reports at the time, it sold roughly 3,000 copies in its first week. Oof. And that's all I really need to say on the game. And if anything, I don't want to reaffirm Shred's existence by talking about it any further. But what is dead may never die, and the cooling off period for the series ended in 2014 when Tony Hawk Pro Skater HD made its bow. I actually remember being relatively excited for its release. At this point, it had been nearly 7 years since I played a Tony Hawk game that I really enjoyed, and Robomodo's decision to take the series back to its roots seemed like the logical route to take after the Ride and Shred debacle. Pro Skater HD was set up to be the ultimate love letter to long-suffering fans like myself, a return to the halcyon days of yesteryear, and a reminder of why so many people fell in love with the series in the first place. Although the pessimist in me was a tad worried that Activision and Robomodo might just do the bare minimum and release a game with less features than the PS1 titles, and hope that nostalgia and affection for the older titles carries a complete turd towards one last payday. But surely they'd learnt their lesson. Oh, for fuck's sake. Okay, look, compared to the past couple of entries in the series, Pro Skater HD wasn't god-awful. Returning to the 2-minute goal-based structure around some classic HDified locations is such an easy recipe to follow that it would take a considerable amount of fuckery to make a complete balls of it. However, it was just sorely lacking. The game featured a grand total of 7 levels from only the first 2 Pro Skater games, had outrageously wonky controls, it had no split-screen co-op, and it lacked many of the legendary songs from those first 2 games. The novelty of revisiting older levels wore off incredibly quickly, and if anything it made me want to simply play the PS1 titles, which felt tighter and genuinely had less performance issues, which is ridiculous. Where the series could possibly go at this point was a depressing thought. Robomodo had tried the modernizing route with Ride and Shred and failed. They had tried a small morsel of a nostalgia-fueled return to the heyday and failed. It was a sorry state of affairs for the once revered and critical darling of the industry. Yet, as fate would have it, there was one last knife to twist into the back of fans.
Working on a Pro Skater game, there's a lot of history behind it.
The pressure to live up to the Tony Hawk franchise is because of that. It's a franchise that people have loved and played for years.
Look, at this point in the video, I'm losing the heart to continually shit on the later entries of a series that I hold so dear to my heart, and you're probably sick of hearing me, but out of all of the games post-American Wasteland, Pro Skater 5 is by far the most shambolic, and it deserves a special kind of disdain directed towards it. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5 was released in 2015, making it the first numbered Pro Skater release since 2002. The presence of that seemingly innocuous number put a hefty weight of fan expectation onto the shoulders of Robomodo, a development team that by this point in time had really proved that they were a curse on the series. But lo and behold, they were given the responsibility to quickly shit out a numbered sequel before Activision lost the rights to the series. That's right, this game exists purely out of legal obligation, and that fact permeates through every single fibre of this game. It's no surprise that this would prove to be Robomodo's Tony Hawk swan song. The game simply fails at all the basics, and it doesn't even pretend to harbour ambitions greater than those basics. The level design is dull and it lacks the flow you'd expect from a Tony Hawk game. The reworked control scheme has a habit of interrupting combos as opposed to lending themselves to an enjoyable free-flowing experience. The graphics are somehow worse than Project 8, and the frame rate continually drops as you navigate your way through various bugs and glitches. It's just horrendously bad. I mean, I could go on, but it's just not even worth it. I criticized Project 8 for lacking charm and a clear identity, but Jesus, this is so much worse. Nothing about this game is what Tony Hawk Pro Skater is about, and it actively killed any desire I had for a new Tony Hawk game. It was heartbreaking to see a game like this sitting on shelves with a €60 price tag attached to it. But whatever about the price, to play it was a lesson in disappointment. I'm tired. Look, it's safe to say that recent times have not been kind to the Tony Hawk series. To see such a wonderful franchise continually lower its standards and lose its distinctive charm and spirit has been one of the more depressing aspects of being an aging gamer. But when I reflect on the series as a whole, it's hard to ignore the heights in which the series reached during its pomp. So, that begs the question, what is the ultimate legacy of the Tony Hawk games? The influence of the Tony Hawk games on a personal level are virtually unmatched by any other video game. These joyous little games introduced me to so many things that I hold dear. The music played across the games not only served as a soundtrack to my youth, but also as a foundation for a lifelong passion in music, and it ultimately led me to picking up the guitar and smashing the drums for myself.
You're amazing, dude.
Thanks. I like to play.
The earnest depiction of the culture surrounding skateboarding led me to start skating myself, and even though I never got very good, I still met many lifelong friends and created some fantastic memories as I rode that board, in summer days of trying to land a kickflip and hanging out until it was dark. Moreover, the filmmaking aspect of the skate tapes featured across the games sparked my interest in editing and movies, and now that I think about it, also ultimately led me to making this very video on this channel. However, while the series had a profound effect on me on a personal level, the truly remarkable thing about it is that its true legacy is right here where I'm sitting. For me, this very skate park in the west of Ireland represents the tangible effect the series had on the world and onto my generation growing up. I firmly believe that without the Tony Hawk games, this skate park wouldn't be here. Neversoft and Tony Hawk spread skateboarding across the world with a product that combined addictive and accessible gameplay with an undeniable and intoxicating identity that harbored the true spirit of the sport. The series managed to do something that select few forms of media have ever managed. They influenced an entire generation of people and made a very real, observable impact on the world. They're a prime example that games can be just as culturally important to society as any great movie, song, or piece of literature. Anytime my mind wanders back to my younger years, it feels like those handful of teen years were a fever dream of untamed madness. Everything on TV appeared wild and chaotic, music was heavier, the world seemed mysterious and inaccessible in a manner that made me want to go out and break those borders. I felt truly untethered in a way I didn't realize I was lucky enough to be, and there's no game series that is intertwined with those days more than Tony Hawk Pro Skater. It's one of those things that left an indelible mark on my life, a line in the trunk that supports all of the fucking wacky branches of my life. So, to Mr. Hawk and Neversoft, I thank you.